Many people ask questions regarding how we in this world can work on a voluntary basis without violence, without the need for people telling others how to live their own lives, how we can organize together without having people still hoarding the resources to themselves and being greedy and selfish, because those parts just seem like they're so integral to human nature. So, how could we get rid of it? Well, the truth is, when you understand this belief in authority or statism, a lot of these concerns start to break down because you realize what's actually causing the evil in this world. A lot of things we can say are evils. The question is always how that evil continues to grow. And that's what statism particularly hits the nail on, which is why it's such a key part of my channel, the content I'm talking about, why I'm saying it's so rare, a lot of people don't know about it, and why I've been telling a lot of people to know about it and encouraging the investigation. But of course, within that investigation, people are still going to have questions, they're going to be curious, they want to know more. And here's an example. I got a comment. It says something I haven't heard talked about. When we go to voluntarism, how could resources be shared? In other words, how to avoid a huge landowner having sharecroppers. And the truth is, people are always going to do evil. People are always going to say, this is mine, this is not yours. But maybe, just maybe, and I can guarantee you, when you have a voluntary world, it doesn't matter what people do because it's voluntary. And I know that sounds weird, but it's because you are not allowing evil to grow. And that's because people understand what is evil and that they should never allow it. Voluntarism is the emphasis, by definition, that everything should be voluntary. So it's basically an objective morality in a sense, kind of like what Mark Passio says. It's like here it's defined, it's just like the non aggression principle, like do no harm and always do no harm. There's no exception, right? And so when you realize that part that says there's no exception, that makes a pretty big deal. And that also trickles down to other aspects of society through the principle of correspondence, because if you recognize the greatest evils and what can turn into the greatest evils, you start to become more aware of those lesser evils. And then people start to look for those other evils and they're more aware of what's happening in the environment. So this is what I answered to this question. I said, as long as everything is voluntary, resources will always be shared and imbalances will come to a balance. That's the mere nature of spontaneity in nature's processes. Remember, it takes the recognition of self-ownership to attain a voluntary free world to begin with. So people will be much more conscious of what they do. There will always be chaos and imbalances. The problem is when they are permissed, and they can only do so under an involuntary system where blind obedience is awarded. You can only have blind obedience when you have statism, this mental slavery where people say it's okay to suppress my conscience, it's okay to do wrong, it's okay to allow this involuntary behavior. So again, it would automatically go against voluntarism. So when someone says, well, what if this wrong thing happens within voluntarism? It's already against it. So you can't really put them together. It's by the nature of voluntarism that it's against immorality. So when you propose any immoral behavior as opposed to it, expect a contradiction or at least an explanation by someone like myself to say, that doesn't really work out. And so here's another thing I said. I said people like you will additionally recognize the monopoly and competition will arise, since again, voluntarism allows it. So this is where you can see like the contradiction is dispelled. Additionally, it is said that no monopoly can exist without government assistance. And this is what the anarcho-capitalists have touched on, people like Murray Rothbard. So it's even interesting to see that over the years in the 1980s, 1990s, in modern day, a lot of our studies on the economy and history is actually supporting the idea that we don't even need to worry about these types of concerns because, well, everything seems to support this idea that if everything is voluntary and everything is free, that liberty will be abound. I mean, there was a newspaper called Liberty that happened after the abolitionist time, and it was ran by a man named Benjamin Tucker. Definitely look into him because he's somebody you would like if you have this type of concern. He's somebody who promoted the free market and voluntary interaction, but he also recognized the problem with people like, abusing resources. So he was able to speak up against both ends. And I think that's important, is realizing like, yeah, people who are corporations, businesses, they're still wrapped in that material world, that left brain dominant world. They're going to abuse their power, even if they don't have an authority, even if they don't have the right to rule, they're still going to abuse their business model and maybe even the people that work for them. And so, Benjamin Tucker really has a good perspective, I would say, on this. And even the anarcho-capitalists really respect his views on a lot of things. And people from other anarchist philosophies respect him too, because again, he's kind of in the middle there. And despite that, what all the anarchists share in common is that do no violence. And so that's what's beautiful about seeing all these different forms of anarchy is like, wow, they can unite around this idea of we don't need to worry about the world. Like, this is why we exist, is to be able to look at all these different problems and address it. And we don't need to use violence or legitimize violence to address it. Because when we ask these questions, we can't let that get ourselves in the way of what our true objective is, which is ending these systems of oppression that we know are oppression. It would be silly to say that this type of question or any type of concern about a free world would prevent us or stop us from trying to attain a free world. And so that's what I'm saying. Don't let these questions get in the way of that progress, because they absolutely can if you get stuck on them. And I definitely would refer people to my latest book that goes into this. I have a whole section dedicated to these different anarchist philosophies and the economy and this concept of wage slavery, because these are all kind of connected to this idea of people who own land can abuse their property, and then this private property problem. And a lot of people have different perspectives on this, but that just actually only reinforces, again, this main idea that we should live in a voluntary world, because nobody agrees on one way of living and one way of doing things. So it's funny how all this kind of just reinforces the idea. And so when people are like, well, look, all these voluntarists disagree with each other, it's like, duh, that's the stinking point. It's like all these anarchists can't agree on economics. Like, yeah, that's the stinking point of anarchy, is because we don't want to necessarily have to agree. It's just that naturally we all will disagree no matter what. Even if we do agree with each other, we can't agree with everybody. That's why we got to live in a voluntary free world. So it's just amazing when you're able to come at it from a holistic worldview to see how people will have all these different questions and worldviews within it. And that's why I can sit back and say that's beautiful. It's amazing. And furthermore, my book on Taoism talks about this idea of spontaneity, going more into the synchronicity of things and the hands-off, laissez-faire approach of economy, where it's like if you leave things be, things kind of manifest on their own. I mean, that really fits in with the Taoist philosophy. So you can say in some ways this might be built into the universe with the fabric of reality, just observing how nature operates. And we are part of nature. So we wouldn't be an exception to the way nature operates. And so when we go against it, it makes sense that, we're always puzzling, trying to find out the solution. But when we're with it, it makes sense that we're more so effortless and we're not really trying to do something. So when we're trying to restrict someone, this big landowner, how are we going to restrict them? Like, what are we going to do to try to stop them, from abusing their power? That would be my question to somebody who asked that question, as like a counter question. What would you do? And if you say, I want to use violence, well, obviously I would disagree with you. But if you say, I want to do anything that isn't violence, I applaud you. And that's the point. It's like, what would you do? Don't ask me. What would you do? That's what the voluntary world allows us, is an abundance of solutions. But that's what makes them solutions, is the fact that they're not violent. I wouldn't consider violence a solution, would you? I consider that a domineering, manipulative way of saying, I want things done my way. It's instinctual. It's not actually intelligent. Because if it's intelligent, it doesn't require violence. This is all part of humanity's evolution in their thinking. And it's also why I wrote my article on what I call the essence of labor. And some of my articles I tend to write in a more of a poetical, deep way. So I did not do a video on this, but I'll just read some of the parts that I have in bold. It says, not all labor will be seen or impacted. That doesn't make it worthless. Every seed sprouts a new tree, and if it doesn't, it contributed to a tree already founded. Every effort, every being goes back to source, and so as with our labors. It's the hidden forms of oppression in others, or even shadows among thyself, which one ought to look for, if they are to expect an outward good. Thus, discipline through honesty may be seen as best practice, if not the work of work, otherwise called the great work, the one great work, right? It is no surprise that the slaves rebel against the master, the citizens against the government, or the farmer against the wealthy. Nature's equilibrium displays itself everywhere. Another reason, again, to sort of trust the way the universe works, because everything kind of works in a balance. That balance gets interfered when we overthrow nature's authority, which again is where statism comes in. In my book, slavery, government is unnatural, anarchy is natural, kind of touches on. And I also mentioned here in this article, the technology in future will only be a threat to those who cannot wield it. Change may imply a linear line to many, but the constant of change implies a circle, for which we need not travel in circles if we were the whole circle itself. This is where the concept of letting go comes in among the process of learning and being the example. And this idea of letting go is also known as wu-wei, or the natural. It's the effortless, the honest, the uncarved block, the clear and rational mind. Big steps can be taken, but those gaps of space will come back to terms with you as you realize the space you walked upon or how you are stretching yourself out too far. So again, just nature's equilibrium and people realizing that as they listen, as they step back, things sort of just fall into place. That goes for anything in this life. If humans stop interfering with the environment will grow. It doesn't need humans to grow. It's like, if you give yourself rest in your body, you allow yourself to rest, you actually become healthier. You actually allow yourself to gain muscle. It's when you're resting. Now, you do have a little bit of effort, a little bit of input, but the majority of the time, you're resting. You're not doing something. You're passive. It's always in that passive where things grow, where things happen, which again is that yin part of the yang in Taoism. And so it's that feminine as opposed to the masculine. And again, this is partly why people have a lot of concerns about the world, is we live in a very masculine world, so it's very action-oriented, business-oriented, so people have that mindset. So they get very technical, they get very wordy, and they really then want to look at the economics and the politics of it. Meanwhile, I'm trying to look at the morality, the psychology, and the philosophy behind it, which then gets deduced to very simple terms. Because if you're going back to the uncarved block in the simplistic state and you want people to have fun and just enjoy life, which is what life is about when you realize the power of psychology and philosophy, that's your conclusion, is let's not worry so much. And, if I just said that to that comment, that person probably would not like that answer. Like, don't worry, man. I'm going to sound like some hippie from the 60s. But in conclusion, and if you study everything I just said in this video and all my other works, you will come to the same conclusion, that you should not worry so much. And our worries are actually what caused us to kind of get in this mess. Our desires, our attachments, our paranoia, our fears. And this is why a lot of people talk about love being the solution. This is why a lot of people talk about, how we need to have positive thoughts if we want a positive world. I mean, it's no surprise. But we just cannot ignore the problem. And we need to know when to act when necessary. Thank you very much for watching. This is Corey Angela. Again, if you want a full in-depth understanding of these different philosophies, of the economic part of it, of slavery in detail, and how this all manifests and works, I'd say there's no better example than looking at the abolitionists and slavery and how that ties in directly. Because again, the abolitionists were the first anarchists in history, first voluntarist, and Auburn Herbert, who invented voluntaryism, literally was part of that movement as well. So I have a lot of quotes from him directly in this book. So be sure to check it out. 440 pages. Look how thick this boy is. It's amazing. It's pretty darn awesome. I love it. Definitely going to share it with a lot of people. This is my pinnacle work. Be sure to check it out. Go to theliberator.us. That's theliberator.us. Thank you for watching.